Great. I guess it's 7 o'clock and we'll start. Hello, everybody. Thanks for joining us on this Friday night. We are going to hear a presentation tonight from our own John Schneider, who most of you know is very interested in office history and patent history in general, and even has I believe it's a grandfather who has
Well, both my grandfather and great-grandfather were inventors, but my great-grandfather, I have his original letters patent in my office here from 1890, and developed an insecticide solution. He was a chemist. So
wow. So a great history in patents yourself and an interest in patents in general.
Well, my great-grandfather and grandfather were inventors. My father was a patent attorney. So, yes, I'm still here despite all that. So that's right.
So patents are in your blood.
I'm afraid that's true.
So tonight, John is going to give us a presentation about the establishment of the permanent board in 1861. And we are very much looking forward to it. Thank you, John.
Thank you. And with that, I'll go ahead and share my screen and get the slideshow started. Get my mouth to work this evening, sorry. I'm going to call it Path to PTAB, and we're talking about the appeals process, which started in 1836 through 1861. Although to really understand what was going on, I'm actually going to go back to the first Patent Act in 1790 and talk about what was going on there, and then what led up to the Patent Act in 1836 and everything that followed with appeals and everything else after that. So if you're all ready, let's hang on and dive into it. Hang on. Let me move my slide. Here we go. Page down. Nope. Okay, here we go. So, as we know, the Patent Act of 1790, which was the first patent law, created a board to review patent applications, and the board was comprised of Thomas Jefferson, Knox, and Randolph, but each of those actually had other cabinet positions, as we're well aware. Jefferson was the Secretary of State, Knox was the Secretary of War, and Randolph was the Attorney General. But they would be required to get together under the statute periodically and review the patent applications that had been submitted. There was a gentleman, as we know, Henry Remsen, who was the Assistant Secretary of State, became the Secretary of the Board, and he would gather the packets of the applications together, send it to each of the individuals for review. They would get together probably about once a month or so to try to review them, decide whether or not to grant the patents. Each one had to sign off on it, then had to go to George Washington to be signed. It was a very cumbersome process. And while they think they were interested in trying to promote innovation and inventions, it really became sort of a pain in the ass to them, to be perfectly honest. It was something outside of their duties. It took a lot of their time, and they really started to complain about it. So that led to what we found in the 1793. So we barely had a little over 2 years of working under the system. They abolished the patent board, but no more. And they went to something that was more just like a registration system that we hear about from countries like Belgium and elsewhere. The office would grant a patent as long as all the formalities were met, which included the description of the invention, the model, the required affidavits, and they would just put it all together, and the clerks would just make sure that the patent was complete, and if it did, they would start circulating it to get the necessary signatures. Still was sort of a cumbersome process, but that's what happened. That continued all the way up to 1836. At least that was what the statute required. But one of the commissioners who was there for a long time, Commissioner Thornton, started to, when he would review, because the commissioner was actually doing a lot of the review. They might have a clerk helping them, but he was actually doing the review of the patents. He started to try to actually look and see if there was any novelty. He would look at publications, other patents he had, go through the models, because remember, even in 1790, we were requiring patent models to see if the things were novel. And so we started also looking for potential interferences where there'd be overlapping cases. So he started requiring, and if he saw something that he thought raised an issue of novelty, he would communicate with the applicant and try to decide whether or not to grant the patent or not. So there was an informal novelty review, but it was really wasn't required by statute, and there was no way of really challenging his decision on that. As I say, this continued until he left the office in 1826. If I remember correctly, he died in office. And some of the commissioners continued to do that, but there wasn't any real formal examination process until they get to 1836. Another interesting thing about Thornton, he also had a nasty habit of self-dealing in patents. If he saw an invention he thought was really worthwhile, sometimes he might actually file his own patent application to try to provoke an interference or cause the true inventor to try to negotiate with him, and he would take an interest in some of the patents. That was obviously not, a lot of people objected to it, but nobody really did anything about it until, again, the Act of 1836, which stated that the commissioner couldn't have an interest in the patents he was reviewing. A little more trivia going on here. So now we come to the Act of 1836, which we know about. That's when we get the examination system we have now. The statute required that the application be reviewed for enablement, for written description. There were first time we were calling for claims. Previously, the patent just had a description of it, didn't have any claims in it. And to continue the requirement for models and drawings we had before, but it started to allow for the hiring of examiners to review them, but their decisions to allow or deny the patent were still reviewed by the commissioner. So they wanted to have some system to appeal the commissioner decisions, whether or not to grant the patent. So the Act of 1836 called for the creation of a board of examiners. They would hear the appeals from the commissioner's refusal to grant a patent. It was supposed to be comprised of 3 disinterested persons appointed by the Secretary of State, with at least one of them knowledgeable in the technology at issue. There was a fee for the appeal. It was $25 to file an appeal, and the statute provided that each board member was to be paid no more than $10 for hearing each appeal. What actually happened was the $25 fee was then split between the 3 of them, so they each got about $8 for listening to the appeal. This didn't really work very well, and as was reported by Commissioner Ellis in his report in 1838, the pay was deemed too low for the number and complexity of the appeals. When it was first enacted, the view was this was going to be something sort of pro forma, it was going to take a lot of time. Well, what happened was in practice, the appeals became very complex. Appellants would start bringing in additional evidence because there weren't any rules like we have now that limited what arguments could be made. So they bring in some new evidence that maybe hadn't been considered. They would present arguments. It got to be a very long and complex process, and the pay was low. I mean, $8 to hear each one of these appeal. It also was difficulty in finding qualified people to serve on the board. Sometimes it take a long time to reach a decision, and a different board was appointed for each appeal. And so you want to get widely conflicting and inconsistent decisions between the board members and the different boards that were there. So basically in 1838, there were 39. Commissioner Ellsworth said, we need to come up with something else. And that's where they came up with the recommendation that was made, which was adopted by Congress, that the appeals from the commissioner's decision refusing to grant a patent could be sent to the chief judge of the U.S. District Court for the District of Columbia. And the chief judge would be paid an additional $100 a year to hear those appeals, which probably when it was first enacted in 1839 was a considerable amount. And there weren't a lot of cases. You know, the patent office at these times was getting maybe 100, 200 applications a year, but the Industrial Revolution was starting to kick in, and we're going to start. And what happens is more and more applications are being filed, more and more appeals are being filed, and it started to become quite a amount of work for everybody. The system seemed to work well. We don't read any complaints or any issues being raised about the appeal system until 1850. At that time, Judge Cranch, who had been the chief judge on the DC District Court for close to 50 years, was getting old. He was about 80 years old when he wrote in 1850. He was first appointed to the court in 1802, became chief judge in 1804. Interesting, if you remember back in constitutional law, the Marbury v. Madison case, where Marbury had been appointed at the end of the previous president's administration. Cranch was also involved in those midnight appointments, although it was not one of the ones that was allowed to go through. But Cranch sent a letter, and we'll see the letter in a second, saying, look, I really can't do this. I'm getting old, I'm firms, there's too much work. Congress, you need to come up with something else. Well, Congress didn't, at least for a number of years. And so Cranch just didn't do any work, and appeals just sort of languished there for a while. And this is the text actually he sent to the Congress, to the Senate, asking to be relieved from his duties, or that somehow the provision requiring him to work be repealed or something else come up there. As I say, this went to the Congress, the Senate, and it just sat there and took for well over a year. But finally, in 1852, they allowed cases to be appealed to the assistant judges in the DC district. So we're starting to open up, we're starting to allow more judges to be involved. There were at least 2 other judges. Some appeals still languished with Cranch, and he actually still didn't act on them. The other change they did was, originally it was suggested that the pay for the to the chief judge be increased to $500. And instead of that, what the Senate or Congress came up with was that the $25 appeal fee would be paid to the judge, directly to the judge hearing the appeal. That sort of creates a little bit of conflict of interest, don't you think? Because here you've got the person appearing before you paying your fee to hear the appeal. And in some cases, particularly interferences, they would do some forum shopping, find a judge who might sit on it for a while and pay him the fee and have it sit, and they would still be able to practice their invention without worrying about the resolution of the interference or even the appeal and what have you. So there were some questions raised with, you really want to have that, have the people paying the judges directly to hear their cases. But even still, with that change to the other judges, there were still long delays. Apparently, one of the other 2 judges in the district court was ill, and it took him over a year before he was able to come back and hear cases. The other problem was the statute required that the original files and the models be transferred over to the judge hearing the appeal. Recall that, there wasn't any easy way to copy a file. If you asked for a copy of a document from the patent office, you had to hire a clerk, and they would then transcribe, literally sit there and rewrite the document, and they were paid basically piecework. They get paid a couple of dollars for, I think it was 10 cents for every 100 words they transcribed. So it was a very long, laborious process to make copies of the files. So in fact, the files were actually completely transferred over to the court. So they're out of the patent office. The model wasn't there for them to be able to use to review other applications, and it would sit there. And oftentimes the records, the papers and the files would get lost because the judge would take them out of the file to look at them and may not make its way back in there. Models were damaged during the transport. And again, you still had judges reaching different decisions because there's no jurisprudence for them to work on, or no set of rules as to what evidence they might hear. Each judge sort of acted on his own and heard the cases as he felt was necessary. So there was still a lot of dissatisfaction going on with this system. One proposal that was made by Commissioner Mason in 1859 was to create an examiner-in-chief position. That would take some of the burden off the examiner to review. The examiner-in-chief would review all the work by the examiners and approve them, much like an SPE might for the people working under him. Part of the reason they were pushed for this is that the duties of the commissioner started to increase. Again, as I mentioned earlier, the number of applications were starting to increase. We're now getting several thousand a year. By 1860, we're up to almost 8,000 applications being filed a year. I know that sounds small by our terms, but remember, in the period from 1790 to 1836, there were only 10,000 patents issued. So now we're getting almost 10,000 being applied for every year. So the numbers of applications are increasing, the workload is increasing. They've only got so many examiners. The commissioner is supposed to review every one of those cases. And something else that I just recently learned about was that starting in 1840, the Commissioner of Patents was also responsible for studying the state of agriculture in the United States. If there wasn't a Department of Agriculture, he would have to go around and collect information about what was going on, but different crops. They were starting to create seed banks. And if you look at the reports of the commissioners that were filed during this period, some, especially in the later years, each one, there'd be 2 volumes about the technology or the mechanical and chemical arts, and then there'd be a whole separate volume of the commissioner's report on agriculture. And it would be hundreds of pages long about the state of growing different types of crops in different parts of the country. So it was a lot of work that he was having to do, and it was taking away from his ability to carefully review the patent applications. So that's why he wanted to have this examiner-in-chief position created. Congress fell on deaf ears, unfortunately. No such position was created. So now we come to a Patent Office Board of Appeals. And this was the first time they actually had a specifically constituted board other than the Board of 1836. But these were a board of patent examiners who would review appeals from the refusal to grant a patent. And was sort of like we are now, after the examiner, but before it gets to the commissioner or went to the courts. It was a temporary board, and it only make recommendations to the commissioner. So they pull three of the senior examiners out. They form a board. They would review the cases and make a recommendation to the commissioner whether or not the examiner's rejection should be sustained or reversed. At the same time, the commissioner at the time, Commissioner Holt, recommended that this board be made permanent, and it was also followed up by several of his successors. And according to the reports that were filed in 1861, the board was considered pretty much a success. In the 2 years that the board was in existence, it heard over 2,000 cases, and only 42 of those were then appealed to the district court. So reducing the backlog of the district court, we're getting people a chance to be heard by a board, and it gave some closure to the applicants, whether their case had been reviewed, and it wasn't just the examiner, took some of the workload off the commissioner. It was a very great success. Part of the problem, though, is it reduced the examining corps by a quarter. There are only 12 paid for examiners, and you're pulling 3 of those out to make the appeal board. And there weren't any real strong rules that had been developed yet, so there were still issues of uniformity. I'm going to diverge a little bit here and talk about one of the examiners who was on that board, a gentleman by Rufus Randolph Rhodes. He'd been an examiner for a number of years, and he was served on the Board of Appeal, the temporary board we talked about, until 1860. The reason why he left in 1860 was he was a Southern sympathizer and went off to offer his services to the South and wound up becoming the commissioner of the Confederate Patent Office. For those who may not know, the Confederate States of America had a patent office. It was one of the first bills that was passed by the Confederate legislature, and it continued operations until the fall of Richmond in 1865. But that's a whole nother lecture or talk if someone would like to have some time, and I'd be happy to give it. But that's the little aside, the connection to our board or the history of our board and what happened across the river in Richmond. Finally, in the commissioner's report in 1860, he went through the history that we've talked about here today, and he repeated the recommendation of all the prior commissioners that we really needed a permanent board here. And finally, as we know, in 1861, Congress finally took him up on that. And this is taken directly from our website. In Bill number 10, they finally passed a rule establishing the board, although they didn't call it a board, but they did have a panel of examiners in chief so that it could review the examiner's rejections and and it was finally implemented in 1861 when we had the appointment of our first 3 examiners in chief. And that's my short history of how we got to at least the board of 1861. And if anybody has any questions, I'd be happy to try to answer them.
Can you hear me now?
Yes.
Thank you, John. That was really informative. It's amazing to see how many issues we deal with today are similar to the issues that the board was dealing with back when it was formed. Getting qualified people to come on the board, dealing with backlogs and time constraints.
Yeah, and just pay. I mean, that was a big issue for, I mean, not that we don't get paid well, but I know we could always feel we could always should be paid a lot more. And that was a big issue, again, in hiring. It wasn't just trying to find people who were qualified, but also then I felt, $8 to hear an appeal, and it wasn't enough. And that was another reason why people didn't want to do it. It was just a short amount of money. And even the judges at the district court were complaining that $100 wasn't enough. And they tried to raise it, but Congress, as we know, can be very stingy, and didn't want to do it, even though the office by that point was supposed to be self-funded. They still just didn't want to release the funds to let them do it. So
Hear you correctly that they paid the money directly to the judge
yeah, that's right.
instead of to the office.
Yeah, because it used to be, we used to go into the office funds and then the office would pay the judge. So that $100 we were paying, there was Judge Cranch was getting, was coming from the office funds, but it would be based upon monies they collected for each appeal. So, but it was, they started paying it directly to the judge. And as we say that, there's some mischief that can occur when that happens.
Yeah.
So,
And it's interesting in this day and age where they've in light of our strikes that director review is implemented to see that the issues that came up in having the director review all the appeals back then, and see what we can learn from history when we go forward.
There's also something interesting that I learned going through this. There were what was known as caveats, and it's actually a lot like a provisional application. It was a partial application that you could file as a placeholder until you were ready to file your original application. I haven't found out what exactly the criteria was for caveats, but you'll see mentioned in the commissioner's reports that in addition to patent applications filed, there'd be so many caveats filed.
Huh.
And it was so everything old is new again.
It is. It is. There's probably still even a talk of a backlog back then to today. Other questions?
Sorry, I was just gonna pipe up on the theme of everything being old being new again. I think Commissioner Thornton is the direct inspiration for 35 USC Section 4, which is why you can't have an interest in a patent.
Yeah, and that similar clause appears in, I forget which the section is, but in the 36 Act, where they specifically put that in there because of what Thornton was doing. And there was a lot, if you read the patent pony, there's a section in the beginning of the book talks about Thornton and his relationship with Fulton and the steamboat patents and everything else, and trying to get a piece of that action as well. That was one of the first ones. He also did some with Morse and the telegraph. I mean, it's just, he saw things and he wanted to, it was his way of trying to get a piece of it, and he would, as I say, he'd file an application and to, try to revoke an interference, and, would settle it by taking an interest in the other guy's patent and whatever fees he got from it, that type of thing. So he wasn't the most ethical guy, although, as I say, he did start to do the examination and pick up, looking at novelty, even though it wasn't required by the statute. But he would also, he found something he thought had some value, he'd try to get a piece of it. So
he's also the guy, though, who saved the patent office during the War of 1812, right?
That's correct. That's correct.
It's a great story if you want to tell it.
I know it in general, and I have to go back and brush up on it to be able to speak about it. But the British were coming in and they were burning Washington, and of course we had I forget what was it? Was it one of the hotel buildings we were operating out of at the time, and they were going to burn the building down. And he managed to convince the British officer not to destroy that building and what have you. And so it basically saved the patent office files and the models as they existed at that time. Unfortunately, the fire of 1836 wound up destroying almost all of that. And there's an interesting story that goes into that. At that time, we were sharing our facilities with the post office, And apparently, at least one theory is that because the post office was under investigation, some financial scandal, and they think that the fire may have actually been started by people in the post office to prevent their records from being reviewed, although it in fact has destroyed our records and didn't do that much damage to them. Another story is though that someone was careless with some burning embers and discarding them, and the building caught fire for that. So no, the true reason how the fire started, we don't know, but part of it may be because the post office scandal was going on, and the post office was trying to find a way out of it, and they burned our records instead.
So the two additional bits on the Commissioner Thornton story is what he told the British that was so convincing was that burning the patent office would be a crime against human knowledge equivalent to the destruction of the Library of Alexandria. And as a reward for saving the patent office, Congress moved in because, of course, the Capitol had been burned down. It was the only official building still available.
Yeah, that's right. That's right.
And another old is new again is this is a couple decades out of currency, but certainly when I was working at the patent office in the 90s, everything was still in paper. And in fact, I remember reading a report by Bob Barr where they determined that at any given time, 14% of the patent files were missing.
Yeah.
And
I remember that lost, missing or misplaced. And I never understood what the difference was.
Well, and it wasn't uncommon walking around Crystal City to see an abandoned cart just full of patent applications.
Well, I remember I didn't work at the office, but some of the partners I worked for at Fish and Neve had worked there, and they were talking about, people hiding application files up in the ceiling tiles and what have you, because they didn't want to see that they had too many things stacked on their desk and what have you. So
we have Bruce Stoner here as a former SPE. I'm sure he could tell stories.
Yeah, I'm willing to tell a few, but when I was a young examiner in 1970, we had some very singed patents in our files, and they dated back to very early times. And we were told, and I don't know, there may have been more than one fire, but the files that we saw had burn marks, and so they were dated to the time of the fire. In terms of the files being stored in the ceiling above the ceiling tiles, there were a number of instances in the time I was there in the early 70s where examiners were accused of mortgaging cases, and they were supposedly hiding the files in the ceiling tiles at that point. There are stories, whether they're accurate or not, about ceiling tiles falling down as a result of the weight being up there. At any rate, there's nothing unusual about that in terms of what you just described.
Yeah, there was a second fire in the 1870s, and not as much of the records were lost. There were a number of models lost, though. That was probably the biggest sadness. But most of the paper files, some were damaged. There were some were lost, but they were able to recreate almost all of the paper files. Some of the models were never recreated. It wasn't as bad as the 1836 fire. Almost everything was lost there. And we're still trying to recreate the ex-patent files, and well, all those models were lost, and some of them have never been able to recreate it. So I think there were about 10,000 patents at the time of the 1836 fire, and my understanding is that maybe half of those files have been recreated, but they're still finding stuff. As people go through their family's records, they're finding patent files and turning it over to us, and finally, so it's slowly being recreated. But and there was an effort in 1836, 1837 to do that, but it was never very complete. So
That's got to be like a great barn find or attic find if you find a very old patent file. It's like
Yeah.
somewhere in your house, right?
Yeah, that's
And
it.
it's amazing what patent models sell for on eBay these days.
Yeah, the patent models are just, I mean, because among the things that were lost were, the original cotton gin and some of the others. I mean, some models were found elsewhere, but the ones that were in the patent office were just gone because, and and it was an art to making those things because they had to be, technically accurate. It was just taking the large invention and reducing it to a miniature, but it had to work and it had to have all the features of the invention there. So there were actually craftsmen who were in the business of making patent models. And that's the required for models went through the 1870s and slowly died out, but people were still continued to submit them for a while. Sorry, Rick,
I
go
was
ahead.
just going to point out, and the director still has the authority under 35 USC 114 to require a model. So I've never seen it happen, but I'd love to just for the novelty.
No, they stopped the really pushing for them in the 1870s. But yeah, it's I mean, people will bring things, examples in for interviews and what have you, but generally they'll take them back and what have you. The one I remember was most interesting was during the cookie patent wars in the early 1980s. Procter & Gamble actually invited the examiner to a hotel room where they'd set up a small oven and they were baking cookies with a prior art and their invention so that he could sample them and reach his own decision as to whether or not the patent should be issued or not. So
I remember my time as a patent examiner, I always enjoyed seeing the models too, but we weren't allowed to keep them because as soon as you take one in, you have to keep it in your office forever.
that's it.
You never destroy it. So it was always encouraged to give them back.
So as I say, I have a model that I was able to buy online from the 1870s that I've got here. So it's a very simple one. Where is it? Oh, yeah, here it is. It's what they call a fire pot for transferring embers between different furnaces and what have you. So it comes up.
All this talk of the first patents makes me think of like what happened to the first board decisions.
Yeah, I have to go look and see that and see what we can
Where they ended up. I think I saw one on Princeton University's website. But it would be interesting to that would be something I'd be interested in looking into is where did the first board decisions go and how did they go over and what happened to them.
The commissioners, in my time, had a number of models in their offices.
Yeah.
And they were very proud of having those particular models on display in the office. And those would rotate from time to time. But that was, it was interesting. There weren't very many models left at that point. When I first came to the PTO, there were in the scientific library, large cases with models. And after that, they seemed to disappear. I'm not really sure where they went to, but early on, there were a lot of models around. And we're talking 1970 or so.
Yeah. Well, there's still some around in Madison and what have you, but the office was actually required to get rid of most of the models in the 1920s. Congress wouldn't pay for the storage anymore of them. So some of the more important ones went to Smithsonian, like Lincoln's model, Morse's telegraph models, and some of the other ones. But a lot of them went to private collections. I think, if I remember correctly, the Franklin Institute in Philadelphia has one, and there's a museum in Delaware, and I can't remember the name of it,
The
that
Hagley
has a
Museum.
large connection.
The Hagley Museum has a large exhibit of them too.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And then there are some that are in the hands of private collectors like myself.
And there's a few in the ones in the Smithsonian are in the Newcastle building.
Yeah, every now and then they'll pop up for sale, but this one actually has the label from the patent office that, with the patent number on it, and the name of the inventor is actually painted onto the side of the model and what have you. So it's it's a true, patent office model. There were some things out there that are sold as patent models, but they weren't the models that were submitted to the US office. So.
Great. Thank you. Are there any more questions? If anybody wants to wait a minute to see if anybody unmutes themselves. Well, that was fantastic, John. Thank you so very much. And thank you for taking the time to give it to us. And
My pleasure.
that's
My
part of
pleasure.
your Friday evening after work, I'm sure.
That's right. We'll go up to happy hours when I get off here.
Excellent. Excellent. Well, thank you very much.
Take care.
Bye-bye. Good night, everybody.
Night.